On Dialogue Weekend, Philippine President Rodrigo Duterte will end the 2-decade-old visiting forces agreement with the United States. What's next for the two countries' relationship? And the U.S. names 5 Chinese media outlets as foreign missions, requiring them to share extra information with the U.S. government. Will media become a new battleground for influence? Now on Dialogue Weekend.
Welcome to this edition of Dialogue Weekend. I'm Xu Qinduo. To start today, I'm joined via satellite by Dr. Xue Chen, Research Fellow at the Shanghai Institute for International Studies. Also via satellite in D.C., Rick Danham, a visiting scholar at the Tsinghua University. And via Skype, we have Professor Robert Kelly, the Department of Political Science at Pusan National University, South Korea. Welcome to all of you. Well, the government of the Philippines has formally informed the U.S. that it will terminate the Visiting Forces Agreement, or VFA. The agreement between the two countries governs the presence of U.S. troops inside the Philippines. If there's no change of mind in 6 months, the agreement will no longer apply. President Trump has said he welcomes the decision as it saves money, a lot of money for the U.S. We'll take a look at the reasons behind the decision and the impact on ties between Washington and Manila. So, Professor Robert Kelly, why has President Rodrigo Duterte decided to terminate the VFA at this particular time, and what is the direct trigger, say?
Yeah, there was some sort of personal spat, right? I believe it was sort of an advisor of Duterte's that wasn't allowed to enter the United States or something like that. But Duterte has been sort of thinking about this kind of stuff for a while, right? And Duterte has made feints towards China in the past and sort of been pulled back because the Filipino military is very pro-American and sort of China got burned a little bit on that. And then he's got this sort of on-off relationship with Donald Trump because he's sort of like the Trump of the Philippines, but, you know, the Trump character is sort of pretty feisty and pretty prickly, and so when Duterte felt that he was being snubbed by the Americans, he sort of pushed back, and my guess is he'll probably come back to China and try to talk to Xi Jinping again like he did before. I mean, this is the problem with sort of Duterte and Trump types as leaders, right? They're so fickle and they're so variable, it's hard to know really what they want. If I had to guess, Duterte won't follow through on this. He'll meet a lot of bureaucratic resistance in the Filipino Congress and the Filipino military, and he'll be forced to step back.
Mm-hmm. Well, Rick Danham in D.C., do you agree, or do you have anything to add for the reasons, behind the latest move?
Well, I would add a little bit of perspective here. Right now, there's a deep divide in American policymaking about the relationships with the Philippines. I mean, historically, it was the edge of American empire from the Spanish-American War in 1898. Donald Trump has a different view. He sees it as a cost center. Having American troops and American military influence there. While the policymakers in both Democratic and Republican parties see it as sort of American influence in the Pacific and a counterbalance to China. So I think Donald Trump doesn't really care, and Rodrigo Duterte may be upset at America, and he thinks that this is punishing the United States. American policymakers strongly disagree with him, but I think Donald Trump just doesn't care, and he'd be just as happy to have the agreement done.
Mm-hmm. Well, Professor Xue Chen from Shanghai, is this like a personal issue between the two presidents, Duterte of the Philippines and Trump of the United States, or is it a long-term strategic move from the side of the Philippines?
Yeah, I agree with you. There is some kind of a personal issue between President Trump and President Duterte. They are both strongmen and cannot be tolerant to the other side if this policy toward each other became very tough. But on the other hand, there's also a kind of a political development between the relationship between the Philippines and the United States. On the drug war against the narcotics in the Philippines, the United States criticized the human rights issue in the Philippines and also supported the opposition politicians in the Philippines, which really, make President Duterte upset about the Trump policy and also toward the Philippines. So since 2016, there's already been a kind of a debate within the Philippines whether the Philippines should terminate this visiting force agreement. Now it's a very interesting moment when there's a kind of a strategic competition unfold between China and the United States. The Philippines' decision would, how to say, delicately might change the balance in Asia Pacific.
Mm-hmm. Well, Professor Kelly, you mentioned the two strong personality of the two leaders, of course, here.
Right.
It's hard to predict, what will come next. Do you see a trend on the side of the Philippines somehow like distancing themselves from the U.S.?
Well, this isn't the first time that Duterte has done this, right? I mean, Duterte has sort of flirted with China and sort of pushing aside the Americans in the past, right? I mean, he came to Beijing, what was it, like 4 or 5 years ago, and he gave that speech in which he said China, Russia, and the Philippines were going to stop American global hegemony or something like that, right? And then, like I said, he sort of met a lot of pushback in the legislature and from the families that kind of informally dominate Filipino politics. And he was pushed back, right? I mean, this is just sort of him being sort of charismatic and sort of off the wall. I mean, Duterte is sort of known for that in the same way that I think that, Donald Trump sort of bounces from one decision to the next, and it's hard to know if he means it or not. That's how I read this thing, too. Like I said before, I would be surprised if this actually follows through. I agree with your other guests who suggested that Duterte will find that he's pushing against an open door, that the Americans won't take this as a snub. Trump just doesn't care. He just doesn't care, right? And my guess is that when this actually makes its way through into the Filipino bureaucracy, particularly the military, which is really worried about China and the South China Sea, they'll push back very hard, and this won't go anywhere. Duterte, he's not a dictator, not yet, and he's going to face a lot of bureaucratic resistance on this.
Mm-hmm. Well, Rick, looking at the issue from Washington, D.C., obviously, President Trump, actually, he disagrees with his, let's say, bureaucracies here. For example, Defense Secretary Mark Esper, obviously, they have different opinions. Esper says this is the wrong direction, there's a regret over that. So how do you see these differences within D.C., within Washington here?
I think it's very significant, and I think it's on almost every international relationship. There is a disagreement between, if you call it the bureaucracy, but it's the State Department, the Defense Department, and Donald Trump as an individual. And the question is, who is running American policy? You have this with China, you have this with Russia, you definitely have it with the Philippines. Add to that the peculiar personal relationship between Trump and Duterte. While Trump has a very good relationship with Xi Jinping, very good relationship with Putin, his relationship with Duterte is sort of strange, and the two of them try to sort of prick at each other, but Trump doesn't seem to care when Duterte does things that are designed to make Americans upset. The Defense Department gets upset, the State Department gets upset, but Trump just sort of ignores it because he doesn't really care much about the Philippines. He doesn't care much about Korea, Japan a little bit more, but it's very interesting because Duterte is obviously trying to get a rise out of Washington, and he's not getting it out of Trump. He is getting it out of the bureaucracy of Washington.
Mm-hmm. Well, back to Professor
That's certainly true.
Kelly. Yeah, please go ahead. How likely, is there anything the U.S. will do to try to reverse the decision or try to change the mind of Manila?
Yeah, I think that last comment was spot on. Trump is just checked out from this stuff. He just doesn't really care that much. Look at the way he's harping on South Korea about parasite and stuff like that. Trump just doesn't care that much about the American alliance architecture in Asia because he's just not that concerned about authoritarianism in Asia because he doesn't care about it that much. So yeah, I think, as it was said, I think you get some pushback from DOD. I think maybe a little bit of pushback from Congress. There'll be some anxiety. The people who actually want to go toe-to-toe with the Chinese, with the PLA and in the South China Sea, they will obviously be worried, right? Because there's no way the U.S. Navy can operate in the South China Sea without at least the Philippines' tacit consent and the basing rights and the rest of it. All that's up in the air. But I don't think that Trump actually cares about that, right? As was pointed out as well by your other guests. I just don't think so. So, let the Filipinos go by themselves. They'll just slide under China's umbrella anyway, right? And so my guess is, like I said, that you'll get the real pushback coming will be from the Filipino military and the bureaucracy and other actors who fear that if they really do walk away from the Americans, then, the Philippines sort of falls under Chinese domination.
Well, Xu Chen, the Philippine side has called the latest step as part of the long process of
Yeah.
breaking free from the colonial chains, obviously referring to the U.S., previously colonization and also the close ties between the two sides. So how will this latest step help the Philippines to gain more independence, let's say, more sovereignty independence here?
President Duterte is quite a special leader, has been bearing this decolonialization in mind. But I should say, on the other hand, the Philippines still have a series of agreements, including the security and military agreements with the United States, like the Mutual Defense Treaty and also the EDCA in 2014. So I cannot exclude the possibility that the Filipinos were taking the BFA as a kind of bargaining chip. Still, there was still a 180 days ahead to withdraw this kind of a decision. So it depends on what the United States responds to the decision made by the President Duterte.
Mm-hmm. Are you saying that the Philippine side, President Duterte is actually, for example, this is a part of his tactics for renegotiation with the United States to make more concessions from the side of Washington? Xue Chen?
There's a kind of a lot of problems in terms of the bilateral relationship between the United States and the Philippines. You cannot exclude the possibility that the Duterte administration would like to renegotiate on a broad perspective of the bilateral relationship with the Trump administration. The problem is, as the other guy said, that President Trump doesn't care much about the Filipino, its position in the Asia Pacific. But this kind of a U.S. and China rivalry in terms of the security issues like the South China Sea and others in East Asia. So President Duterte's decision really makes sense for this kind of broader picture in Asia Pacific. There's very little, how to say, field chips that President Duterte have. The termination of the BFA could be one kind of bargaining chip to arouse the attention from the Washington, D.C.
Mm-hmm. Well, still 180 days to go. We will follow that, whether the mind will be changed. Let's speak of this rivalry, great power rivalry between China and the U.S., shifting focus to this relationship. Say the U.S. State Department has designated 5 Chinese media outlets, including us, CGTN, as foreign missions. So they are required to register their employees and properties in the U.S. with the U.S. State Department. This is the latest move by the U.S. side to increase more pressure on China, following, of course, continuous lobbying against Huawei, the Chinese telecom giant. So, Rick, the United States designation of the 5 Chinese media outlets. So what do you see that, and what's the real reason behind that? Is that the Chinese media are becoming too influential in D.C.?
I don't think it has to do with Chinese influence. I think it is a slap at the Chinese government and a reminder to the American people that the Communist Party is what the Chinese media works for, and that there's a very different system of media in China and in the U.S. And the idea is, from the State Department, is that Chinese media is propaganda for the Communist Party and the government, and this is a way to highlight it. However, no action goes without a reaction, and the Chinese government has reacted negatively and swiftly. And so I think we could have 2 debates here. One is about the diplomatic give and take, and the other is about the media systems and Chinese journalists in Washington and all around the United States becoming pawns in the rivalry between the 2 foreign ministries.
But look, Rick, you are in the business of media industry. The Chinese media in the United States, yes, there's a presence for decades. And, if there's any violation of the U.S. law, they will be punished. If there is any interference of U.S. elections, for example, U.S. domestic politics, No, there's no such record, right?
Right. And I mean, I know a lot of the CGTN reporters, and they are reporters with integrity. So I do not believe that this has anything to do with the CGTN journalists in the United States. Just like the Wall Street Journal reporters who are being expelled from China, it had nothing to do with their presence in China or their work in China. It has to do with bigger issues that are beyond their control. And I mean, coming from the American media system, I don't like the idea of governments telling, no matter where you're from, telling you you can or you can't do anything. And I'm uncomfortable with what the U.S. State Department is doing with Chinese journalists, and I'm uncomfortable with what the Chinese government is doing with Wall Street Journal journalists.
Mm-hmm. Professor Kelly, you know, it's something bigger than, say, the media, or Chinese media, U.S. media. Probably it has a lot to do with the background, the rivalry between the two countries, between Beijing and Washington. But I have a question, you know, why not Russian media, for example, Russia Today?
Yeah, that's actually an excellent question. I think Russia Today actually probably should get in trouble, to be honest with you. I don't know any American academics seriously who go on RT anymore because it's so obviously an outlet for just raw Putinism. Specifically under this administration, my guess is there's been no movement against RT because President Trump is rather sympathetic to the Russians. I mean he knows that the Russians helped him win in 2016. He won't admit it, but that's pretty widely understood. So no, I think that's the most obvious reason. But on CGTN and the others, I think it's just straight up ideological competition, right? I mean, the United States and China are sort of like stumbling towards some collision or competition in the future, and it's going to spill into all kinds of different realms, and that includes yours, that includes media, and I think that's really all this is. I wouldn't read too much into it. I would just see this as just sort of another step down the road that we shouldn't go down, but we're going to.
Mm-hmm. Well, Xu Chen, what's your take of the recent move by the U.S., you know, to designate the Chinese media as foreign missions here?
It raises several questions. First one, whether it will hamper the so-called the United States Institute, the freedom of the press. This China Daily Xinhua News Agency is not a kind of a really newly founded mass media and station in the United States. It's been decades. Right now is the worst moment because the Chinese are fighting against the coronavirus diseases, which has also very serious economic impacts on China's economy. Right now, this kind of decision, it really matters for the Chinese people. It's 1.4 billion people. Whether it's not only the DC. The politicians in D.C. looking at this kind of a decision, but also how the 1.4 billion people right now in China looking at this kind of a decision. You want to draw a line between the so-called regime and the people, but it's very easily for you to cross line of so-called legitimate concern of national security. Or it's just crossed the line of toward a kind of a hostility. But it's also not only deemed by the politicians in D.C., but also how it will be looked by the Chinese people.
Mm-hmm. But Rick, you're teaching, you know, journalism in Tsinghua University. You know, people talk about Chinese media being propaganda. But then, you know, people would ask, you know, who is going to make the judgment call of which media outlet is propaganda? For example, Fox News. Some people would say that's pure propaganda, right?
Right. Well, some people say that Fox News is the Trump News Network, even though he's been critical of certain Fox News people who are not properly pro-Trump. But yes, I mean, propaganda is subjective. What somebody decides is propaganda. I mean, again, my training as a journalist in the United States tells me that you want to allow the freedom of speech, even if it's speech that you don't agree with. And so I'm uncomfortable when the U.S. government puts restrictions on others. But I do think you can have a philosophical discussion about the mission of journalism in China is different than the mission of journalism in the United States. The mission of most of the journalism in China is to represent the state, to support the positions of the government and the Communist Party. Now, that doesn't automatically mean that it is that there's any breach of journalistic ethics, but it's a part of a debate. And what I'm uncomfortable with is when another country says what you're saying is propaganda because we disagree with it. So I think you have to separate the distinct media systems from the journalists who are operating in the other countries. And I don't think that the journalists, legitimate journalists, should be victims of the dispute, of philosophical or political dispute.
Well, very unfortunate. But look, also the Chinese, whether is in response to that, of course, that's controversial. Anyway, China revoked the press cards of 3 Beijing-based Wall Street Journal journalists. So what's your take on that? From the Chinese side, obviously, it's about a pinning piece with the title, calling China the sick man of Asia, which is probably nothing to U.S. Viewers, but to the Chinese, it's humiliating, it's insulting because of historical reasons.
Right, and I understand that. You're right about that. Most Americans would not understand it. Immediately when I saw that headline, I knew that this was going to be very sensitive and insult a lot of people in China, and I understand that. To me, there's a difference between, number one, the editorial page and journalists. I know as someone who was a reporter in Washington for many years, I often was blamed for the editorial policies of my newspaper, even though there's a separation in the United States. But I understood why people were mad if there was an editorial criticizing them. And so to me, that's one of the issues. And the second is the journalists in China were not responsible for the editorial itself, but the Chinese government felt that there was some need to send a message. And I believe that the Wall Street Journal journalists in China were innocent victims of this, but I do understand that the Chinese government felt that it had to send a message to the Wall Street Journal, even though it was a columnist in America who wrote that, not a Wall Street Journal journalist in Beijing.
Well, all this has a lot to do with the recent outbreak of the coronavirus, of course. So, Robert, how do you think the charge that the virus has reawakened a form of racism in the West? This is actually another piece from Washington Post, well written probably. Do you see the rise of racism in the West?
Well, that's a tough one. I mean, China is ground zero for the coronavirus. I mean, if you're suggesting that the travel bans are racist, I don't really think that's accurate. I think everybody realizes that banning travel in and out of China is extraordinarily risky and difficult for the global economy.
Well, the racism means,
no.
In the daily life, for example, if you are, hailing a cab, or they say, oh, you have an Asian name, or you look Asian, sorry. I can't have you on my car because, somehow you are viewed as equal to a virus.
Oh, if there have been sort of stories of that kind, then that's obviously deplorable, but I haven't heard anything like that, certainly in any kind of, scale that would warrant that. I mean, I would argue that Asian media outlets should be very, very cautious about throwing around that kind of language unless they can really substantiate it. It's just going to create major blowback in the United States and a huge blow-up over something that's already really, really controversial, which is how to deal with the coronavirus. Again, if it can be substantiated at any kind of scale, it's not just a couple of sort of weird, strange characters in an airport someplace, okay, but barring a few isolated incidents from some idiot guy somewhere in an airport, I would be very, very cautious about applying that kind of explosive language.
Well, that's actually a piece from the Washington Post, but we wish there were only a few exceptions, a few racist cases over there. But let's leave it there for now and take a look at this week's newsmaker.
엄숙히 선사입니다. 또한 또 이랬던 이명박 정부 청와대와 공직자들에 대한 최근 검찰 수사는 처음부터 나를 목표로 하는 것이 분명합니다. 다만 바라건대 역사에서 이번 일로 마지막이 되었으면 합니다.
So, former South Korean President Lee Myungbak has been sentenced to 17 years in jail on corruption charges. Professor Kelly, you are in Korea. So, what do you think about the result, the case itself? Is it politically motivated or simply corruption?
Yeah, it's a great disappointment. I actually thought Lee Myungbak was a pretty good president and wrote an article once arguing that, so I have to sort of swallow that one. I'm not sure if I'm a good guest for you on this one. Is it politically motivated? No, probably not. I mean, South Korea's politics are sort of shot through with corruption. South Korea ranks something like 48 on the Transparency International score, which is a really high number given that South Korea is the world's 13th or 14th biggest economy. Moon Jae-in, the current president, was elected in part for campaigning to bring that number down, and it really hasn't turned out to be the case. There are a lot of sort of structural reasons in South Korean campaign finance for why this is the case. South Korean parties aren't allowed to raise money outside of certain periods of time, very narrow periods of time, which drives a lot of sort of this underground shilly-shallying, looking around for money. Every single South Korean president since South Korea's democratization has been investigated like this. Many of them have been convicted and gone to jail. I would be amazed if Moon Jae-in manages to escape this dragnet after he leaves office in a couple of years. I'm not surprised. I'm surprised at the length of the time. That's pretty amazing. But that he got nailed for corruption is, no, it's not a surprise.
Well, Xu Chen, do you agree? Why do South Korean presidencies often end badly? Lee Myungbak is actually the fourth president, which retired and then failed to rest in peace, let's say.
If you trace back the South Korean politics into ancient times, you can see there's a kind of connection between their feudal system and the political culture to today's politics. There's a kind of, for example, regional discrimination between the Chenla-do and Gyeongsang-do, and also this kind of a power struggle within the monarchy during the ancient times. This is very prominent, very fierce for those kind of clique power struggle under this king and also this monarchical system. Right now, you can still see this kind of political culture took place in South Korea. Very few South Korean president ending up well. So this is a division between the so-called progressive political force and the conservative political force. But it can really trace back to the ancient time and also the ancient political culture of South Korea. And also there's a connection between the so-called crony capitalism and this huge family business groups. Its connection with the politics also play a role in this kind of legal issues and also to do with the ending of the South Korean presidency.
Well, with that, we are coming to the end of today's show, and many thanks to Dr. Xu Chen from Shanghai Institute for International Studies, Rick Denham from Tsinghua University, and Robert Kelly from Pusan National University. You can also watch us on the CGTN app or on YouTube. I'm Xu Qinduo. You can find me on Twitter, Xu Qinduo. Thank you for watching. See you next week.